Welcome to the very first Masters in Public Policy Practicum presentation of 2015. Thank you all for being here. I'm Sam Chiu.
I'm Alvaro Allende.
I'm Daniel Tublin.
I'm Fernando Zavala.
And this afternoon, we would like to talk to you a little bit about the riveting subject of school finance and our search for a better accounting system for California's local control funding formula. The great Albert Einstein said, he's often quoted with saying, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. This is the mindset we want to impart to you today. In the spirit of Mr. Einstein, our Practicum project focused on framing a specific problem that we felt is at the core of school financing, school accounting codes. It has been a winding, at times frustrating, but always interesting road, and we are excited to share the fruits of this journey with you. So I'm going to quickly go through the agenda for today. The exceptional Mr. Tublin will start us off with a background of California's funding scheme for schools and its accounting scheme as well, looking at the standardized accounting code structure. He will then go on to elucidate the problem that we found, and then talk about our project and the methodologies and questions that we sought to answer. Then my esteemed colleagues, Mr. Zavala and Mr. Alliende, will talk about the specific case studies that we went into, both in the public sector and in the private sector. Unfortunately, you'll have to suffer through me talking a little bit about takeaways, and then we'll all come together at the end to conclude with what we feel California may do going forward. Mr. Tublin.
Alrighty. To begin, a little bit of background about how California public schools are financed in the state. Now, for decades, there were aspects of financing called categorical expenditures, which was a specific revenue designated from the state that had to be used for a specific expenditure. This was a mode of compliance, and the goal of this was to use specific revenues to hit specific goals. In 2013, many of these categorical revenues were done away with. New autonomy was lifted, or new autonomy was given to these local education agencies. It was designed to give more discretion to each school and allow them to actually understand and hit certain areas that were priorities. No longer was there a compliance mode, but more of a problem-solving effort. Now, with this new autonomy, we have an uncharted territory in terms of how schools are going to spend this money. Previously, we had been giving them goals through the state, but now the local education agencies are in their control of where the money is going. The method which the state designated is called the Local Control Accountability Plan, the so-called LCAP. And what this did was open up the budgetary process to parents, to community members, and to decide collectively what goals we're going to try to hit with this new unrestricted funding that we have just been given. Now, the next step is to track to see if districts are actually spending money towards these goals. And in order to see where money is going, you need to have an accounting system. And in place right now is the California Standard Accounting Code structure. Now, a little bit of the history. Prior to 1993, many individual accounting structures were across the state. There was not a uniform way of collecting data, and the state could not aggregate that data to make informed decisions. In 1995, the state adopted a plan to create a uniform accounting system code, and that's been in place ever since. So, the same structure is in this place. First, you have 6 fields with 19 different digits of coding. You have a fund, which identifies the fund specifically receiving revenue, paying the expenditure, or otherwise being affected by the transaction. So certain specific activities that were defined in certain objectives of a local education agency in accordance with special regulation, restrictions, or limitations. Then you have a resource, which tracks those activities that are funded with revenues that have special accounting or reporting requirements that are legally restricted. This is where many of the categorical funds would be demonstrated. You have a resource. This is the next project, or I'm sorry. You have a project year which identifies the timeline in which a certain project that lasts more than 1 year is in place. You also have a goal which demonstrates what aspect of the specific expenditure, where is it going. Some examples include K through 12 education, migrant education, and also transportation. You have functions, which identifies activities or services performed to support or accomplish one or more goals of objectives. Examples of these include instruction, school administration, pupil transportation in general, and general administration. And then you have objective, which classifies the actual expenditure or commodity or service that is used for that specific function, like salaries, classified salaries, employee benefits, books, and supplies. So here's the issue. We have this local accountability control plan, right? And the LCAP is most comprised of educational goals. Goals like increasing student achievement in certain areas like English language learning, and also implementing the Common Core standards in math and science. So goals like, this is what we're going to find as the front end. These are educational goals. And the back end are the expenditures that are actually occurred. It is the planning and then the execution. And right now, it's really hard to determine if there's a connection between the front end and the back end, because the accounting structure is outdated. So many aspects of educational goals include many aspects of expenditures. But with our client, we decided to focus specifically on instruction. Instruction means expenditures that attempted to reduce class sizes, expenditures attempted to increase staff development in specific areas, and overall teacher salaries. Many educational goals depend on instruction. We've seen through research like researchers like Marguerite Rosa. We've also seen through other academic literature, and as well as actually looking at the specific part of the budget. 62% of all of most schools, or on average, 62% of the budget of most schools is dedicated towards instruction and instructional salaries. So, instruction is a huge aspect of educational goals, and if we really want to understand how the front end ties to the back end, we need to understand where instruction is going. But the California Accounting Practice Manual does not include a detailed categorization of instruction at all. Simply, teacher salaries are lumped in with a huge sum of teacher salaries are not broken down accordingly. That's a math teacher salary. A math teacher's salary is accounted the same way as a French teacher's salary. They are lumped into one large category. And so without categorical expenditures, there's no way of determining whether we're actually hitting these educational goals that we say that we're hitting, that deal with instruction. So here's an example of what the updated accounting manual. If you look at the resource code that was striked out, 7294, this was a categorical program that was specifically designed to increase staff development in mathematics and reading. Now with the new LCFF, this is no longer required. Now this unrestricted, now the same funding is now going through, the same amount of money is given to the school, but they do not have to code it in a certain way, or they do not have to code it in the same way. They can code it with a big 0. So over here we have, as we can see, prior to the LCFF we have a resource, 7294, which is mathematics and reading. We have a function, which is a teacher, which is instruction. And we have an object, which is teacher salary. So this was going towards math and reading for teacher development and instruction. But now if we look to with LCFF, we have a resource code 000, which means the unrestricted resource. And we have a function, the same object, instruction and salary. But this could be going to many different things. This could be going to foreign language, this could be going to history. We have no way of determining if it's actually hitting the goal we say we do, we want to hit. So the LCAP may illustrate these overall goals we want to hit, but our accounting structure doesn't really show us if we actually made that goal. So here's what we want to discuss, and the questions that we kind of realized we want to ask after we looked at this issue. Looking outside of California's school accounting system, what if any lessons can be learned? This is where we're going to look at our case studies. Are there accounting systems that provide methods for evaluating specific educational goals? This is tying that front end to the back end. And then there are examples of accounting systems that provide for a detailed categorization of instruction and staff-related expenses. This is the area we really wanted to focus on with our client. So here's our approach to this issue. These are mainly this is a mainly case study project. And the selected cases are Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Finland, which Fernando will discuss, charter schools, nonprofits, and private organizations, which Alvaro will discuss. And for looking at these cases, we interviewed many professionals within the area, as well as looking over the accounting manuals and discerning what was available, what was not available. We also looked at academic literature, discussing overall trends within the country, and as well as other outside sources. So with that, I hand it over to Fernando.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, thank you all for being here, and you have to bear with me. We'll go over 4 cases with me and then 3 with Alvaro. So we wanted to have a base to compare California's current system with what's happening across the country and across the world in terms of school accounting. So we chose 3 states and 1 country, and I'm going to go a little bit over what are the reasons that we decided to choose these states. First of all, we chose Massachusetts, which, as you may know, is being deemed as an example of educational performance, and it ranks consistently in the top of the ranks in the nation in terms of educational performance. Then we chose Pennsylvania, which is a kind of an interesting example of a state that has high academics and a highly autonomous core of school districts, and it doesn't hurt that we had 1 member of the team that was a proud member of Pennsylvania as well. And then we chose Texas. So Texas and California share not only their large sizes and large populations, but the fact that they're being affected by changing demographics and specifically by immigration in their public school sectors. Also, we decided that we wanted to go overseas and take a look at what's happening across the pond. And so we chose the example of Finland, which, as you may know, it's kind of a worldwide reference point in terms of educational outcomes. Although there's a lot of debate about that, but still the country ranks top in most of the educational indicators during the last years. So we wanted to see what's happening in Finland regarding to accounting, right? So let's first begin by Massachusetts. So what's the public school sector like in Massachusetts? So first of all, the funding is primarily local, as opposed to California, which has primarily state funding. In Massachusetts, over 57% of the funding comes from local sources, and this translates into highly autonomous school districts. So there's a higher degree of autonomy within the state school system. Regarding their funding structure, there's something called the Chapter 70, which is a funding system developed by a group of experts back in the years for Massachusetts. And this system is basically designed to have an equalizing effect, so basically leveling the playing field between wealthier districts and poorer districts across the state. Regarding their accounting system, what's different from their accounting system towards California? So first of all, they have a 3-level accounting system. If you remember, California has 6 fields with a lot of details in them. So Massachusetts has a simpler accounting system. It has a lower level of detail, but interestingly enough, all information is centrally consolidated and presented to the public in a very accessible format. So we were able basically to go over a lot of the information or all the things that happen in Massachusetts by pulling up Excel charts from their website, which is not the case in California. So here's an example of how the code composition works in Massachusetts. There's a fund account on the first place with 3 digits, type of account reporting category, and subcategory account. I won't go into every detail of these fields, but basically the idea I want to leave you with is that this is kind of a simpler way of presenting accounting information. Okay? So then Pennsylvania. So what's the public school sector like in Pennsylvania? Again, Pennsylvania relies heavily on local funding or local source for funding. Over 60%, depending on which district, comes from local sources. And this significant local funding basically gives a lot of discretion and autonomy to school districts and local education agencies in terms of budgeting and planning. So we have a highly decentralized systems in terms of budgeting and planning decisions. Regarding their accounting system, they have a uniform system across the state, as in California. Interestingly enough, they include codes that are meant to be used at a local level, and they're not required to be flow over to the state, right? So that their system comprises 7 different dimensions, and probably the most important part is that Pennsylvania includes what's called the subject matter. So basically, they link expenditures to subject matter in each of the categories. So you analyzing the data, you can say, for example, how much money was spent on each district on math, for example, or on a different subject matter. Okay. This is an example of how the code structure works in Pennsylvania, and so you can see that there's a subject matter here that relates this kind of funding, which is this is a transaction, or this shows the purchase of books for this school in Pennsylvania, math books. Finally, in the U.S., we looked at Texas. So Texas is one of the largest educational systems in the country. There's over 1,200 districts in the state, and also the school funding comes from primarily local sources. Over 56% is local. And the funding structure is what's called a 2-layer system. They have a baseline, and then they have a second tier which allows the state to level the playing field for, from wealthier districts to poorer districts. Interestingly enough, the local autonomy is countered with statutory requirements, specifically on information. There's a lot of information requirement that districts have to provide the state annually. Regarding the accounting system, up until 2007, the state had a wide variety of accounting systems. So basically, each district has had its own accounting system, which made impossible to compare across districts within the state. But since 2007, the state moved towards a standardized accounting system, which is currently in place. The accounting system is based on a code structure, much like the California SACs. Also, there are local codes available, as in Pennsylvania. And what we found interesting about this system is that although they moved into kind of what we see as the right direction by standardizing the accounting system across the state, they haven't been able to accomplish what we think is the ultimate goal, which is to provide details related to instruction. So still, they kept what's called function 11. Function 11 is a big number that takes more than half of the money on each school, and that accounts for first teacher salaries, but also includes trip expenditures, instruments, sports equipment, and a wide variety of other things that obviously do not relate to teacher salaries. So here's an example of the Texas code structure. And yeah, function 11, it takes a lot of things in it. So finally, Finland. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but our main conclusion about Finland is that there's not too much different about what they're doing in Finland as what's happening in the US, especially in those states that have moved towards standardized accounting systems. So Finland public school sector has a lower level of uniformity than the US. Their population is also more homogeneous, so there are reasons for that. And they have low state control, so that there's low involvement of the central level in the school decisions. Funding is more or less equally divided between federal and local sources, and most, if not all, the funding comes in non-categorical forms. So schools are the ones who get to decide where to spend the money in each case. The accounting system is, as I told you, very similar to the US in its structure. Some interesting facts: they don't account for instruction-related details, which was kind of a disappointment for us. Their report includes what we call budget to actual composition, which is an interesting element to be considered in the case of the US, because there's a wide discrepancy sometimes between the budget and actual. And they have daily automatic updates from local agencies to the central level in terms of accounting information. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Alvaro.
Thank you, Fernando. So after analyzing all these either state or country's public school systems and following the advice and recommendation of our client, we decided to broaden the scope of our research and go out and see what other kinds of organizations were doing. We started with charter schools, which are a completely different take on public education, and we also looked at both non-profit and private corporations to look at how the private sector is taking care of both social and private issues. So we'll start with charter schools. The funding structure of charter schools are actually very much similar to those of public schools in every state. They have a high level of autonomy, but they report mainly to their authorizers. They operate as individual units or as members of larger charter school networks, and they can decide whether funding is going directly from the state to the school or having the funding go through the school district before getting to the school. And just like public schools, which is something we found surprising, it is not all unrestricted, but there are also some categorical funds put into the charter schools. In terms of accounting, they face the same issues as public schools. They don't have much level of detail, especially in terms of instruction. They are also required to develop the LCAPs, but they look at them as more as a compliance thing and not as a really useful tool. And one of the interesting features of charter schools is that they have centralized financial management, which not only takes out the burden of administrative stuff from the school, but also provides a way to compare figures and metrics from school to school. And very interestingly, their higher autonomy has not translated into any innovation in the financial or in the accounting report system. So even though they could have taken advantage of it, they still haven't done it, and there's something they have to address. And as I said before, instruction remains generally a black box in terms of they cannot break it down and look at where specifically the money is going. In terms of non-profits, their funding scheme comes from donors, either single or multiple ones, and the level of control the donor exerts on the organization depends highly on the style of the donor, basically. The really interesting thing about non-profits is that is the donor-agent relationship. So, in which the donor holds the threat of withdrawing funding if the goals he sets, or he or she sets, are not met. So the donor says, these are the metrics we're going to track, this is the financial report you're going to give me, and these are the goals we're going to pursue, and if you don't achieve them, I'm going to withdraw funds from you. So that's obviously a very powerful way to enforce the accounting systems that the donor wants. Having said that, there are issues sometimes, especially like some administrative burdens for non-profits when they do have multiple donors, and every donor provides a different template, so they have to accommodate to both templates, which sometimes differs. So that's complicated for them, and very interestingly, they do track relevant metrics. So the metrics that are set by the donor in conjunction with the non-profit are actually being measured and tracked at a very high detail. We even found some non-profits that are tracking the way their employees are spending their time. So after every single day, every employee goes to a to a nonprofit software, and they input how much time, how many hours they put into each and every one of the projects that he or she is working on. Finally, private corporations, as we know, rely on funding from investors, either private or public, either from debt or equity. And the really interesting thing about private corporations is that their goal is very straightforward and easy to measure, which is profit. From there, they can reverse engineer all of and get to all of the relevant behavioral related metrics that they need to pursue in order to get to their goals. And they also enjoy a high, I mean, they don't enjoy, they achieve a high level of adaptability in the way that they can change the metrics that they're tracking, and they can also change the behavior. They can even shut down particular sections of the corporation if needed so. And so that level of adaptability is a really interesting thing to analyze. Most of this discipline and behavior comes from from the discipline that investors require from the management. And there is a cultural focus on performance metrics in which most of all of the employees are centered into achieving certain specified goals. And with that, I leave you with Sam to talk about the takeaways.
Thank you, Alvaro. Fernando's going to pass around a chart that we made. Unfortunately, it couldn't fit completely on the screen, but it's partially illustrated on the screen. And what we did was we tried to aggregate all of this information that we were getting from all of these different case studies and bring it together in some form where we could actually draw takeaways. And so what we did was we listed all of our case studies and we designated whether their accounting systems go into a high level of detail, which we feel is absolutely necessary for proper accounting. Furthermore, we talked about transparency. Transparency in our minds means is the public able to review these documents, see them, and are they accessible, really? I encourage you to look at all of these at your leisure. I'm not going to go through them line by line, but I would like to draw your attention to 3 specific examples. And those are the examples where both the high level of detail and transparency we responded the same. First of all, with Finland, and as Fernando mentioned, this was a disappointment for us in a sense, because we thought that as a high achiever on the international scale, we may have something to learn from them. But it turns out that, just like the US, Finland has its own share of challenges when it comes to accounting. And unfortunately, they do not reveal a high level of detail in their accounting. And not only that, but their accounting is not really available to the public. The numbers that are available are very aggregated numbers. They're very high-level numbers that you can get through the state statistics website, but they do not allow any ability to drill down and to see where this funding is going. Conversely, we have nonprofits, which is an interesting case because, as Alvaro mentioned, they can provide a high level of detail. And in some cases, they do allow for a very high level of transparency. So there are specific cases that we saw where they could be a model for how accounting could move. But at the same time, there were instances where the transparency wasn't there. So that was more of a toss-up. And finally, Pennsylvania was a really interesting example for us because they did, much like Massachusetts and Texas and California to a degree, they provide a high level of transparency. And then at the district level, notice the asterisk, at the district level, they get into the subject matter codes. But unfortunately, that information isn't required at the state level, so that you can't get that in aggregated form. I just want to talk a little bit about some big lessons that we learned, and then I'll get into a couple of specifics as well. The big lesson from all of these is that school systems across the country and even internationally, whether public or charter, face very similar challenges when it comes to accounting. And that includes the idea of standardization, as we saw in the case of Texas. standardization is not enough. Having a uniform code is not enough. It's merely the first step in being able to compare and get information on how money is being spent. Furthermore, we have this idea, and we kept on coming to it through our discussions with our interviewees, as well as with some of the experts in the education field, that the ultimate goals of accounting should be to reveal leverage behavior and reveal behavioral tendencies. Instead of merely focusing on old-style tracking numbers, books, hard expenditures, we want to know how money is being spent and be able to extrapolate from that how to better spend that money. In a sense, what they kept on coming to is this idea of strategic resource allocation, and it was a buzz phrase that we kept on hearing, and how best to allocate spending to get the best outcomes. Finally, in this sense, local autonomy is trending upward. California is definitely not the only state to do this. It was apparent in all the states that we looked at. Local autonomy is definitely on a trend, but the tools that states have at the moment do not allow them to fully take advantage of that autonomy. Lastly, some lessons that we brought from the private sector was that metrics should directly factor into the desired outcomes and should satisfy all interested parties. The notion of backward engineering your metrics, looking at a specific outcome that you want and moving backwards from that to actually identify the specific metrics that will absolutely factor in to what that outcome would be. And also that they noted that everyone who contributes to those metrics, who enters information in, should have some say in what they are to incentivize accurate reporting. And then lastly, in the general sense, systematic agility. Alvaro touched upon it in terms of the business model, that if you're going to establish an accounting system, it should be able to incorporate new metrics that come up as time goes by seamlessly and make those effective measures. So having a system which allows new metrics to be incorporated in a very easy fashion, it would allow for cross-school comparison, enhance the level of details, and would allow schools to better understand where their money is going. Some very specific lessons that we learned, as I mentioned, was that uniform accounting codes are merely the first step. Standardization is key, but it is only one step along the way there. Having a common format for the yearly reports increases transparency. In the case of California, information on finances is not consolidated onto one page, but you have to go to several different websites, and if you want information on the LCAPs, you have to go to each individual district website. And furthermore, the actual data for the financial data in the SACS model is not easily accessible by every computer, and you'd have to be able to have the program to run it. So having Excel-type documents would allow for a much easier access by the general public. Time tracking could be a possible means to elucidate behavioral tendencies. As I mentioned, backward engineering is an option for how to create metrics. And then one of the keys that we took away from Finland was the notion that their system updates very consistently and in a timely manner. Their finances aren't a once a year, twice a year type of issue, but they are actually updated daily, which allows them that budget versus actual comparison, and that's a model that we can look at. So how does this relate to California, bringing it back home? As we mentioned at the very beginning, we feel that instruction is key to not only understanding outcomes, but understanding where the bulk of our money is going in education. So and how do we get there? We can introduce better levels of detail to the SACS code, which we saw at the beginning. If we are sticking with the SACS codes, then we can add maybe one or two more levels of detail, which would allow further exploration of how money is being spent. Furthermore, as we mentioned, the consolidation of where all of these expenditures are, the financial reports and the LCAPs. If we can put them in one place, easier access, more transparency. And finally, in what was one of the more exciting parts of this project, was learning that there's a cottage industry dealing with this exact problem. Entrepreneurial minds are attacking how to visualize data for districts, how to make it more effective for them to make better decisions. And we talked to two companies, Alvaro and Decision Science Labs. Here's an example of what Decision Science Labs offers in terms of outcome analysis and aggregating data in visual models to be able to access and interpret. And they have different models. One of them is a service which comes in and collects the data that you have and makes it into some form that is easily digestible. Another one offers a software which allows you to do it yourself. So we can see that there are systems that are moving towards a solution, and perhaps we can learn even more from them moving forward.
So, the eminent 19th century philosopher, writer, and educational reformer, John Dewey, wrote, and I quote, "A problem well put is half solved." And I dare to say, in this case, is 90% solved. So we hope that with this presentation, we have contributed for you to better understand or to better form yourselves an opinion about the problem that we are facing in terms of this challenge. So this study is merely the beginning of a path that we hope that will continue towards looking for actual solutions to this challenge.
And when we think of accounting, we tend to think of these suits. We think of paper pushing, boring. But at the same time, if you look at them a different way, it can be pretty sexy. So it's important to look at accounting as an important, sexy part of the budgeting process for schools.
The California's moving to a more autonomous system through the LCFF was only the first step, and we believe that the state has not adapted its accounting system to go hand in hand with that first step. So there's a need for the accounting system to be modified so that it keeps pace with the new funding scheme.
And finally, if we're going to get to this state of strategic resource allocation, then our LCAPs must move away from compliance. How districts and charter schools view the LCAP needs to move away from compliance and make it an actual effective tool. We have to leverage technology in order to visualize data and make it more accessible, and that data should be transparent and accessible to the general public. And ultimately, we hope to make the accounting reflect behavioral variables, eliminating monolithic expenditures such as instruction.
So with that, we really thank you very much for your attention, and we are more than ready to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.